Throughout my childhood, my grandfather would repeat the same warning whenever I dared to approach the ruins of the old Everly house. Nothing grows where the soil was watered with silence. I used to laugh, thinking it was just another one of his rural metaphors, old farmer wisdom wrapped in drama. But there was something in his eyes, a stiffness, like he wasn't just recalling a story, he was reliving a pact. Now, at 42, sitting in front of a recorder, surrounded by musty folders and reels of microfilm, I understand exactly what he meant, and why everyone in Ashgrove still avoids saying the name Everly out loud. If this story already made you uncomfortable, you might want to subscribe to the channel. Trust me, the next revelations are far more disturbing. The Everly house rested on top of a gray hill, cloaked by skeletal trees and a constant fog, even on summer mornings. It was a 3-story Victorian structure with decaying porches, half-fallen shutters, and an iron ornamental fence that creaked like it moaned. The windows were always shut, covered with thick lace curtains, and the front door was flanked by 2 angel statues, their eyes scratched out. A detail I would later discover repeated in other structures connected to the family. The Everlys arrived in town in 1933, coming from New York. Donovan Everly was a quiet attorney, refined, with a low voice. His wife, Clarissa, was more talkative but just as calculated. They had a theatrical way of appearing normal, as if they rehearsed their very existence. It didn't take long before they began the adoption process. First came Thomas, only 3 years old. Then, at almost regular intervals, Miriam, Joel, Elsie, Ruth, Caleb, and finally, Abigail. 7 names officially registered, 7 faces photographed for county archives. But not a single neighbor ever saw them walking down the street. No teacher remembered hearing their voices in class. No local doctor had any record of appointments. Still, the Everlys insisted everything was fine. Homeschooled, protected from the evils of the outside world. And since no formal complaint was ever made, and no missing child was directly linked to the house, the entire town chose to accept the silence, chose not to ask questions. Years later, when the manor was finally condemned after the last Everly died in 1995, no children were found. No bodies, no evidence, no belongings that proved 7 lives had ever grown within those walls. Only preserved rooms, untouched cribs, and on every wall, a name, handwritten, repeated. I came back to Ashgrove out of professional curiosity. I wanted to write a story, something between investigative journalism and a macabre chronicle. But the deeper I dug, certificates, letters, torn newspaper clippings, the clearer it became that the truth was stranger than fiction, and that there was a reason people still whisper that name with fear. Everly. This is the story no one dared to tell. A story about pacts, silence, and children who never left home. You're about to hear all of it. It was never supposed to be more than a detour. When I accepted the assignment, it was under the guise of local interest journalism, a seasonal mystery to be packaged in moody black and white photographs and vague suggestions of a haunting past. The Everly estate was on paper just another abandoned house with a strange history. I'd done pieces like it before. Rural disappearances, forgotten churches, whispered curses that never made the evening news. I didn't expect to stay. I didn't expect the letter. And I certainly didn't expect what waited behind the basement door. Ashgrove was smaller than I remembered. The streets hadn't changed much since my last visit as a teenager, back when the Everly house was still only the subject of ghost stories told in parking lots after football games. The general store had become a hybrid inn and post office, its sign half faded and swinging from one hinge. I checked in under my own name, unsure whether that was a mistake. The man behind the counter, Lawrence, paused when I told him why I'd come. "You're not the first," he said, eyes narrowing, "but maybe you'll be the last." My room was clean but barren. The wallpaper peeled in corners, and the floorboards creaked under every step, but it wasn't the room itself that set my nerves on edge. It was the envelope waiting for me, aged parchment, no postage. My name in black ink, deliberate but smudged. Inside, a single message: "You've come looking for the wrong story. The children were never adopted. They were collected. If you want to understand, find Reverend Finch. He'll give you the key, but do not go alone. A witness." That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind played the names on loop. Thomas, Miriam, Joel, Elsie, Ruth, Caleb, Abigail. The same order they appeared in every archived record. Adoption papers dated neatly apart, as if choreographed. The next morning, I visited the town records office. It was closed, indefinitely. A handwritten sign on the door read, "Staffing issues." I found the library next, hidden behind what used to be a schoolhouse. The local history section had been gutted. The archivist, a young woman named Jeanette, looked nervous when I asked about the Everlys. My grandmother used to say the children never aged, she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. She swore they were always 7, always the same 7. She gave me a name, Reverend Harold Finch, retired but still living behind the old stone chapel at the edge of town. I found him tending a dry patch of soil near the cemetery gates. 93 years old, bent but sharp-eyed, his fingers still moved with precision. I knew someone would come eventually, he said. They always do. Curiosity is like rot. It spreads. Inside the chapel's rectory, Finch unlocked a steel cabinet and pulled out a dusty box labeled Everly Estate, Restricted. Inside were 3 funeral pamphlets, Donovan, Clarissa, and Abigail. The rest of the so-called children were conspicuously absent. No caskets for them, he murmured, because there were no bodies. He handed me a heavy iron key, cold to the touch, the cellar door. But what's sealed behind it was meant to stay forgotten. The house itself sat behind a tangled garden of thorns and ivy, as if nature had tried to reclaim it but had been held at bay. Boarded windows, rusted gates, but the structure was intact, too intact. The wood hadn't rotted. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something else, antiseptic, metallic. I entered through a broken coal chute, crawling on elbows and knees until I reached the basement. It was unsettlingly pristine, clean stone floors, a work table with neatly arranged tools, and at the far end, a door of ironwood bound in chains. The key slid in with unnatural ease. Behind it, a corridor descended in a spiral, its walls carved with names, not scrawled, but carefully etched like a ledger. Each name repeated again and again, paired with different years. Thomas Everly, 1934. Thomas Everly, 1947. Thomas Everly, 1960. Thomas Everly, 1973. The pattern repeated for each of the 7 names, every 13 years. Always in October, always around the new moon. On the lowest step, a final entry, Abigail Everly, 1995. Below that, a door made of blackened oak. Carved into it a symbol, 3 vertical lines intersecting a circle, like a branded sigil. And beneath it, 18/13. I didn't open the door, not yet. My breath caught in my chest, and I realized my hands were shaking. This wasn't a mausoleum. It was a calendar, a record, a vault. Back at the inn, I began comparing the town's missing persons reports. 13-year intervals, always in October, always around the new moon. I called the adoption agencies listed in the old records. Most were defunct. One woman answered, retired, now in hospice. When I asked about the Everlys, she paused for a long time before whispering, they didn't adopt, they exchanged. The children came from elsewhere. That night, Reverend Finch died in his sleep. They found him clutching a photograph, a sepia-toned image of 7 children standing in a row, faces blurred. On the back in faded ink, the cycle, 1919. A cycle that hadn't started with the Everlys, but one they had inherited and perpetuated. I was no longer reporting a story. I was unraveling a legacy, one that had claimed generations and left no one unchanged. I returned to the Everly house the next morning, armed with gloves, a crowbar, and a growing sense of dread. The cellar had awakened something in me, not fear exactly, but a deep ancestral unease, as if my body recognized a danger my mind had yet to fully process. Still, I couldn't stop, not after what I had seen, not with the pattern beginning to take shape. The living room was the first room I managed to breach from the inside. Behind a barricaded door layered in dust and rusted nails, I found a space suspended in time. Velvet drapes turned to cobwebs, furniture covered in white sheets like corpses awaiting burial. The wallpaper was floral but faded into sepia. The scent was old wood, mildew, and lavender oil. Again that persistent sweetness, unnatural in decay. On the mantel above the fireplace, a family portrait hung crooked. It was the only framed photograph not shattered or face down. 7 children stood in a line, flanked by Donovan and Clarissa. The adults' faces were stern, rigid. The children's features were oddly indistinct, as if the exposure had been tampered with, or as if the image itself resisted clarity. Upon closer inspection, I realized something chilling. The outlines of the children's faces had been meticulously scraped away, leaving shallow indentations on the photographic paper. I lifted the frame and found a date etched on the back in cursive script. Taken autumn of 1947. Second cycle complete. Second cycle. The implication was undeniable. If each cycle spanned 13 years, then the first must have begun in 1934, the year Thomas was first recorded. And if the second ended in 1947, that meant the children hadn't changed, hadn't aged. not in the traditional sense. Upstairs, I discovered the study. The door had been locked, but the hinges gave under pressure. Inside were tall bookcases, a desk covered in correspondence, and a grandfather clock stuck at exactly 11:13. The tick of silence in the room felt deafening. I found journals, not full diaries, but ledgers of behavior, discipline, routine, pages written in the same handwriting over decades, all signed with the initials D. One entry caught my eye immediately. It was dated October 3, 1960, and read, "Miriam continues to speak out of turn. Joel has begun humming during mealtimes again. Elsie refuses to bow before the symbol. If they cannot be synchronized before the 13th, the offering must be adjusted. The seed must remain unbroken." There was no mention of toys, birthdays, schoolwork, only obedience, timing, and ritual. A series of letters tied together with black twine revealed something even more disturbing. Correspondence with other families. Names I did not recognize, but towns I did. Briar Hollow, Marrow Creek, East Marlin, all rural, all infamous for unsolved child disappearances over the last century. One letter, dated June 12, 1973, read, "Dear Mr. Everly, we received the boy in good condition. His silence is promising. We hope this completes the third alignment. May the 13th fall clean. H.S. Marrow Creek chapters, alignment, clean 13ths. This wasn't isolated madness. This was structure, coordination, a ritualistic architecture passed from hand to hand. I began photographing everything, the letters, the portrait, the journals. But one photograph in particular stopped me. Found inside a locked drawer, wrapped in wax paper, it depicted a stone circle in a forest clearing. In the center stood 7 figures. Children, I think, though their proportions were subtly wrong. Their arms were too long, their faces covered with burlap. On the back of the photo, Initiation, 1947, Black Hollow. The forest clearing was familiar. I had passed it on the drive into town, just past mile marker 18 on County Road 13. I mapped the dates, 1934, 1947, 1960, 1973, 1986, 1999, and now 2012 had passed unnoticed. The next cycle would be 2025. That meant I had less than a year. One final room remained, the nursery. The door was painted with stars and moons, but the color had faded to gray. Inside were 7 beds, perfectly made. Above each one, a nameplate: Thomas, Miriam, Joel, Elsie, Ruth, Caleb, Abigail, and beneath each bed a pair of shoes, polished, unworn. On one of the dressers, I found a music box. When opened, it played a distorted lullaby I didn't recognize. Inside was a note, handwritten in red ink. "They never leave. They only change faces." That night, I reviewed the photographs, trying to make sense of the pattern, not just in years, but in names, behavior, geography. The Everlys weren't lone actors. They were caretakers, stewards of a recurring transaction, a harvest perhaps, or a containment. And each cycle required 7 vessels, 7 children, 7 years apart, 13 years per cycle. And one name always appeared first: Thomas. I began to wonder, what happens if a cycle is interrupted? What happens if the offering isn't completed? And why was I brought into this now? The answer came in the form of an envelope slipped under my door at the inn. No name, just a single sentence written in the same red ink as the note in the music box. "You're not the first to ask that, but you might be the last to survive it." I slept with the lights on that night. The first rule of Ashgrove was unspoken, but absolute. Do not talk about the Everlys. That silence wasn't the awkward kind born of tragedy. It was curated, enforced through generations, as if a part of the town's foundation relied on its preservation. After 3 days of trying to gather interviews, it became clear that my presence had stirred something unwanted. Conversation stopped when I entered a room. Doors remained shut, even when I knocked politely and announced myself. I wasn't being ignored. I was being protected, or quarantined. I changed tactics. Instead of asking about the Everlys, I asked about Ashgrove's history. That's when I met Eleanor Rusk. Eleanor was 86 years old and lived in a converted barn near the southern edge of town. Her husband had passed decades earlier, and her children had long since left. She offered me tea and a slice of burnt apple pie, and when I gently asked if she remembered the Everly children, she laughed, a brittle, humorless sound. "Children? My dear, those weren't children. They were echoes." She motioned for me to follow her into the back room. There, spread across a low table, were dozens of newspaper clippings, photographs and letters. Some were yellowed and cracked with age. Others looked like they had been recently handled. At the center of it all was a black binder labeled 13. She opened it with reverence. They came every 13 years, 7 of them. Always the same names, always the same smiles. But no one ever saw them grow. One article, dated October 26, 1973, reported on a town harvest festival. A single photo accompanied the piece, a blurry image of children playing near a scarecrow. Eleanor pointed to one of them. That's Elsie. Same hair ribbon every cycle. I have a photo from 1960 that shows her wearing it, and another from 1986. Still the same. She flipped to a page with a torn church bulletin. Scribbled in the margins was a hand-drawn symbol, the same sigil from the cellar door, a circle intersected by 3 vertical lines. That's called the sign of containment, Eleanor said. I found it etched into the underside of every pew in the old chapel before they restored it. She explained how the town council used to be larger, with 13 voting members, until it was quietly reduced to 7 in the early 90s. 13 watchers, 7 vessels, always the same ratio. When I asked why no one had ever reported this, why no journalist or state investigator had stepped in, she led me to a filing cabinet. Inside were copies of letters sent to various agencies, child welfare services, newspapers, even the FBI. None had received responses, or rather, all had been marked insufficient evidence or case closed. It's not that they didn't listen, she whispered. It's that someone higher up was already listening and protecting it. Later that night, I received a call from a blocked number. The voice on the other end was male, older, and strained. You need to leave. You're looking too closely. They'll bury you in paperwork, and then they'll bury you for real. Before I could respond, the line went dead. The next day, a man in a gray sedan followed me for several hours as I tried to visit old sites related to the Everlys, the schoolhouse, the county hospital, the abandoned train depot. Each location was either sealed off, under construction, or recently purchased by shell corporations with names like Cycle Holdings and 13th Key LLC. Back at the inn, I compiled my notes. 7 children, 13-year intervals, always the same names, always adopted under legitimate paperwork, always disappearing from public life shortly after, and no death certificates, no burial records, no DNA evidence, just ritual, just repetition. I tried contacting surviving members of the adoption agencies listed in the old files. One answered, a woman named Gloria Newell, now living in assisted care in Tennessee. She remembered the Everly file immediately. They were priority cases, she said, came from the top. We were told not to ask questions, just sign the transfers. When I asked if she'd ever seen the children herself, she hesitated. No, only the photos. But the strange thing was, the photos never aged either. I asked what she meant. They were the same photos, every decade, same faces, same posture, but always a new date. I asked if she had copies. She said yes. When I asked her to send them, she paused. I'll try. But if something happens to me, make sure people know. They were never meant to grow up. They were meant to be used. That same night, Eleanor Rusk's house burned down. The official story was faulty wiring, but I had been there. I had seen the perfectly functioning breaker box. I had photographed it. The fire consumed everything except a single metal frame, the binder labeled 13. It was delivered to my room the next morning with a note. Keep going. Finish it. The town won't. I opened it again. At the back, a map, hand-drawn, yellowed, labeled with dates. 7 points circled in red, forming a perfect heptagon around Ash Grove, each point marked by a structure long since demolished. A barn, a mill, a foundry, a chapel, a schoolhouse, a crypt, and the Everly estate. The center point, a tree, oak, dead since 1995. Beneath the map, another message written in ink so faint I had to hold it under lamplight. When the roots rot, the fruit repeats. It became clear. Ash Grove wasn't just complicit, it was the ritual. The layout of the town, the silence of its people, the missing records, all part of an architecture of repetition. A conspiracy not of criminals, but of caretakers. Generations sworn to protect the cycle, to maintain containment, and now I had stepped into their circle. I returned to the Everly estate under cover of darkness, guided by the map Eleanor had left behind. The air was cold, unnaturally still, as if the town itself held its breath. I had memorized the sigil carved into the cellar door, a circle intersected by 3 vertical lines, and I now understood its meaning. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a warning, a seal. This time, I opened the final door. Behind it lay a descending passage, older than the foundation above. The air was thick with damp stone and a sweetness that clung to my throat, lavender and rot. The stairs spiraled downward for what felt like an eternity until the walls shifted from stone to packed earth. Then at the bottom, I found the first chamber. 7 pedestals encircled the room, each bearing a wax figure of a child. Thomas, Miriam, Joel, Elsie, Ruth, Caleb, Abigail, their names etched into brass plates at their feet. But these weren't just effigies. The skin was too detailed, the hair too real. I stepped closer and saw stitching beneath the wax. Seams, preserved fragments. These were not representations, they were remains. In the center of the room stood an altar of obsidian, cold to the touch, carved with the same sequence of numerals found throughout the estate, 18/13. Above it, an iron chandelier held 13 black candles, long since burned down to ash. I opened my notebook and checked the dates again. 7 names, 7 vessels, every 13 years, beginning in 1934. That made 18 cycles. The math was exact, but something didn't add up. Why wax? Why preservation? I found the answer in the next room. It was a library, or what remained of one. The shelves were carved directly into the stone, filled with crumbling tomes and journals wrapped in leather. Most were illegible, but one, bound in human skin, had a title pressed in gold leaf, Corpus Lucidae, the Doctrine of Return. The text was in Latin, but many passages had been translated in the margins by a hand I recognized from earlier ledgers, Donovan Everlys. According to these notes, the Everly family had been part of a centuries-old sect devoted to a belief called repetitio corporis, the return of the body. The doctrine held that the soul, when anchored properly, could be recycled through identical vessels, allowing a continuous preservation of essence. In other words, immortality, but not spiritual, physical. Each vessel, each child, had been sculpted, educated, and prepared for hosting the essence of a previous initiate. The ritual required 7 vessels per cycle, renewed every 13 years. The names had to remain unchanged. The order had to be maintained. The repetition was not symbolic, it was mechanical, and the price was flesh. I found diagrams, grotesque illustrations of the extraction process. The ritual began with isolation, followed by a cycle of memory erasure and imprinting. At the end of 13 years, during the October new moon, the essence of each vessel was harvested through a ceremonial bleeding. The essence, or substantia memoriam, as the text described, was collected and stored in obsidian urns, each marked with a number and a name. And beneath those shelves, I found them. 7 urns, black, smooth, cold, each sealed with wax and inscribed with Latin. Thomas, Anima I Miriam, Anima Sue, Joel, Anima III, Elsie, Anima 4, Ruth, Anima 5, Caleb, Anima 6, Abigail, Anima 7. I reached for the one marked Thomas. The instant I touched it, something shifted in the room. The candle ash stirred, the air tightened, and I heard, or felt, a voice. Not spoken aloud, but pressed against my skull from the inside. It said only, "We do not die, we return." I dropped the urn. It didn't break. The stone absorbed the impact. I stumbled back, breath shallow, vision blurring. I had seen enough. No, I had seen too much. But there was more. Behind the altar, hidden beneath a false stone, I found a staircase descending further. At its base, a crypt-like corridor lined with child-sized niches, each holding what could only be described as preserved shells, empty bodies, perfectly intact, ageless, and in the center, on a slab, rested an 8th form. This one was unfinished. No name, no stitching, no clothing, just a pale, waxy shell, waiting. I stared at it, and realization dawned like a poison. They were preparing another cycle, not 7 this time, 8. A correction, an expansion, or a replacement. Suddenly, it all clicked. The warnings, the letter, the photo from 1919. The pattern wasn't just about children, it was about candidates, about me. I was not here by accident. I had been drawn in, fed the mystery, primed with documents, guided to open the door. I was the 8th. Not a witness, not a journalist, a vessel. One final journal confirmed it. In a clean, pristine, leather-bound book placed deliberately on the slab, a page dated October 2nd, 2024. The outsider has arrived. He asks the right questions. He follows the signs. His body is healthy. His voice is steady. The 8th vessel is ready. It was signed, A. Everly, Abigail. But Abigail had died in 1995. Or had she? My breath caught. The room seemed to close in around me. And then, faint footsteps. Soft, deliberate, from above. I ran. I don't remember escaping the house. Only the cold night air burning my lungs as I stumbled back to town. I didn't stop until I reached the chapel. And there, nailed to the door, was another envelope. Inside, a photo of me. taken through the cellar window, watching, and below it, a single sentence. Cycle 19 begins next year. You are already part of it. I left Ash Grove with no intention of ever returning. I drove for nearly 9 hours, avoiding major highways, stopping only for gas and caffeine. The documents, photographs, urn schematics, and digital backups were with me, sealed in a hard case strapped to the passenger seat like a co-pilot. Every mile I put between myself and the Everly estate was both a relief and a deepening unease. I wasn't just running from a story, I was running from a mechanism. My first instinct was to publish, but I knew this story wouldn't survive a blog post or podcast. It needed institutional force. I contacted an old mentor, a federal investigator turned private intelligence analyst. I didn't say much, just enough to get him interested. 3 days later, I found myself in a windowless room in Chicago, presenting the entirety of the Everly findings to a joint review panel made up of FBI analysts, anthropologists, and forensic archivists. They listened, they took notes. They did not speak until I finished. The room was quiet for a long time. Then someone finally said, "This is bigger than we thought." The next day, the Everly estate was placed under federal quarantine. Officially, the grounds were being evaluated for chemical contamination. Unofficially, they were preparing to open the vault beneath the house, the chamber of mirrors, the urns, the altar. I begged them not to enter without full ritual protocol, but they had already dismissed the warnings as psychological artifacts. Mass suggestion, they called it. That was on a Tuesday. By Friday, 3 agents had gone missing. No traces, no distress calls. Surveillance footage showed them entering the basement, descending past the wax figures, and then nothing. The feed cut out. The time log simply jumped from 11:14 to 11:17, a 3-minute void. The response was immediate. The site was sealed with lead plating and industrial welds. Engineers poured 10,000 pounds of concrete into the substructure. They declared the house structurally unsound and demolished it at dawn. But what emerged from the rubble wasn't silence. It was attention. Satellite images of the site's sudden transformation began circulating online. Drone footage leaked. Independent researchers started to connect the Everly pattern to other rural towns with 13-year disappearance cycles. Briar Hollow, Marrow Creek, East Marlin, names I had seen in letters, names Eleanor Rusk had underlined in red ink. A coalition of parents, those who had lost children without closure, began organizing. They demanded answers, not just for the Everly 7, but for dozens of cases across the country. They called themselves the Cycle Breakers. 1 month later, a whistleblower within the National Archives released a document titled Project 1813. It described a confidential study, initiated in 1948, into rural anomalies involving synchronized disappearances, identity repetition, and multi-generational adoption fraud. Ash Grove was mentioned 16 times. When the story hit national news, I was asked to give testimony behind closed doors. I presented everything: the sigils, the journals, the mirror chamber, the unfinished vessel. When I explained the implications of the doctrine known as repetitio corporis, a senator leaned forward and said, almost whispering, "Are you suggesting the Everlys were creating manufactured souls?" "No," I answered. "I'm suggesting they were preserving them." The official reaction was mixed. The FBI launched a limited task force. The Department of Justice denied involvement, but it didn't matter. The public had already decided this was real. A week later, someone burned down the town records office. The fire consumed 200 years of municipal documents. No suspects were arrested, but a message was painted on the blackened brick wall in white chalk. 7 remembered, 8 await. I knew what it meant. The urns were in federal custody, stored in a temperature-controlled vault beneath Quantico. The original plan had been to destroy them, but every attempt failed. Acid, fire, pressure. The stone absorbed it all. At one point, one of the containers leaked a black vapor that corroded steel and caused hallucinations in the handling staff. The protocol was changed. No more contact. The vault was sealed. In Ash Grove, the land was seized. All structures were razed. Survivors were relocated. A memorial was constructed using the original wrought iron fence of the Everly estate, formed into a heptagon. Each point bore a brass plaque with one of the Everly children's names. At the center of the monument stood a pillar of black glass. Etched into it were the words, "Here they returned, here they were taken. May no more repeat." But that was not the end. 2 weeks after the dedication ceremony, I received a letter at my temporary residence in Boston. It bore no return address. Inside was a photograph. A young boy, sitting on a wooden bench, pale skin, dark eyes, wearing a neatly ironed collared shirt. He looked about 7 years old. On the back of the photo, a single line, Thomas, Cycle 19, Year 1. I stared at the photo for a long time. He looked familiar, too familiar, as if I had seen him before. In photographs, in dreams, in mirrors. I contacted my FBI liaison. He traced the origin of the envelope. It had been dropped off at a mail center in Kansas by a woman matching the description of Abigail Everly. But Abigail had died in 1995. Her obituary was on file. Her death certificate was official, and yet no body had ever been recovered. That same night, I received an encrypted audio message. A distorted voice whispered the following: "The house is gone, but the door remains. It does not need walls, only names and belief." My role was clear now. I had been used, not as a vessel, but as a scribe, a recorder of the cycle. And once a story is told, it spreads, like seed. But I also knew something else. The pattern had been broken. The house was destroyed. The records were public. The conspiracy was unraveling. And somewhere out there, a boy named Thomas, or something that wore that name, would no longer have a home to return to. For the first time in almost a century, the ritual had been interrupted. But interruption is not the same as destruction. Not yet. After the Everly revelations, nothing returned to normal. Not in Ash Grove, not in Missouri, not even in me. What began as a local investigation evolved into a national reckoning. Within 2 months of the demolition of the Everly house, over 50 communities across the United States submitted historical reports detailing patterns that echoed the Ash Grove cycle. 7 children, 13-year intervals. Towns that had once dismissed oddities now scoured their archives for missing files, erased adoption records, and shuttered orphanages. The federal task force, now expanded under the codename Initiative 18, issued a statement urging citizens to report any historical documentation or lived experience involving synchronized child disappearances, repetition of names, or ritualistic adoption behavior. Over 3,000 submissions arrived within the first week. But the reforms went beyond investigation. The Department of Health and Human Services launched a full audit of private adoption agencies. Over 100 licenses were suspended. Several state-level offices were shut down entirely for mishandling records or failing to detect forged documents, many linked indirectly to entities like 13th Key, LLC, and Cycle Holdings, the same shell corporations that had shielded Everly property. Public schools, particularly in rural areas, were asked to review past rosters for anomalies. Students who appeared in photos but were never officially registered, names that repeated with no family lineage, children who vanished mid-year without explanation. In over a dozen districts, patterns emerged, and in 3 counties, entire buildings were closed for forensic excavation. Simultaneously, cultural institutions began to react. The National Museum of Folklore and American Ritual launched an exhibit titled The Echo Children Myth or Memory, featuring materials recovered from Ash Grove, including scaled models of the wax figures, audio recreations of the lullaby, and a replica of the obsidian urns. The exhibit became a phenomenon, drawing crowds who stood in silent horror as they read transcripts from the Everly journals and watched reconstructed footage of the mirror chamber. But there was resistance. In parts of the country, especially where religious fundamentalism intersected with political power, the revelations were labeled fabrications, part of a government psyop or an anti-faith conspiracy. Groups formed, calling themselves preservers of the cycle, claiming the Everly method was not evil, but sacred. A few even began petitioning for the reconstruction of the Everly estate as a spiritual center. Then, in late August, something happened that shattered any remaining doubts. An encrypted file was uploaded anonymously to a decentralized server. It contained high-resolution scans of a manuscript older than anything found in Ash Grove, pages dating back to 1768, written in Latin and Greek. The text outlined a doctrine identical to repetitio corporis, complete with the same sigil, the same cycle structure, and a detailed explanation of the 7 vessels ritual. The manuscript had been stored in the private collection of a defunct European society known as Fraternitas Lucidae Memoriae. Translation notes accompanying the manuscript suggested the ritual had originated in the Black Forest region of Germany before spreading, via settler migration, to North America in the early 19th century. A voyage manifest from 1829 listed the Everly family name among a group of 14 ritual practitioners bound for Pennsylvania. This wasn't just American, it was global. The implications were immediate and chilling. Suddenly, reports came in from parts of Canada, Argentina, northern Italy, and western Poland, all referencing similar child disappearance cycles, and in some cases, identical names. The cycle had always moved through silence. Now, in the age of connection, it had been exposed. And with that exposure came panic and retaliation. Two of the lead researchers involved in the Initiative 18 task force disappeared during a conference in Brussels. Their hotel room was left untouched. Their research devices were found scrubbed. Days later, a letter arrived at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. It contained only 7 words: return the vessels, restore the 13th gate, no fingerprints, no trace. Still, the work continued. Colleges created new departments of ritual anthropology. Survivors and descendants of affected families were offered reparations and trauma counseling. Books were written, documentaries aired, but with each new voice added to the conversation, the outline of a deeper structure began to emerge. It wasn't just about 7 children. It was about design, the spacing of towns, the architecture of churches, the placement of wells, trees, graveyards. One historian demonstrated that, when mapped correctly, towns like Ashgrove formed interlocking heptagons, geometrical sigils across the land. At the center of each, a site of origin, and beneath each origin site, something sealed, or rather, once sealed. One by one, those seals began to break. In September, workers restoring an abandoned monastery in northern France uncovered a stone door bearing the exact same markings as the Everlys cellar. The door had been painted over and bricked shut. Behind it, they found a dry crypt, 7 mummified forms, each wearing a name tag: Thomas, Miriam, Joel, Elsie, Ruth, Caleb, Abigail. I stared at the photographs for hours. I knew the faces, even without features. And then, a final pattern emerged, a pattern that drew everything together, from the Everly home to the mirror chamber, from rural Missouri to Central Europe. Every 13 years, 7 children. But every 104 years, 8 full cycles, a rupture, a 13th vessel, an opening. I went back to the photo I had received. The boy on the bench, the one labeled Thomas, cycle 19, year 1. He wasn't the first. He was the beginning of the rupture. Cycle 19 had not just started, it had evolved. And somewhere out there, I was still marked as part of it. There are nights I still wake up before the alarm, always at the same time, 11:13. My breath caught, my body cold, my ears ringing with the faint trace of a lullaby I never knew before Ashgrove, but now cannot forget. I've moved 5 times in the past year, each city farther from the last, each home more secluded, not because I'm running from them, not anymore, but because some part of me is still listening for the sound of small footsteps in the hallway, for the soft creak of a music box lid opening on its own. The urns remain under government custody, sealed behind reinforced steel. The house is gone, the ritual exposed, the names known, but the story lives. It moves now in whispers, in forums, in the dreams of those who've seen too much. People reach out to me, often at odd hours, telling me they found the name Thomas scratched beneath a school desk, that a child named Abigail disappeared in a neighboring town, that a church mural was painted over, but the same sigil keeps bleeding through the plaster. I used to think I was unraveling a myth. Now I understand. I was recording a pattern, one that never ends, only resets, one that adapts. The boy in the photo, the new Thomas, hasn't resurfaced, neither have the others, but sightings have been reported, not as children, as adults. Identical strangers spotted in different towns, always 7, always silent, always near a site that was once sealed. I no longer ask why I was chosen. I know the answer, because I wouldn't stop, because I kept asking, because the cycle doesn't fear believers, it fears recorders. My walls are covered in maps now, threads connecting places I've never visited, but feel in my bones. My phone rings with blocked calls I never answer. Once, I picked up. There was no voice, only breathing, and then a whisper. He's ready. I've stopped trying to convince people. Either they understand, or they will, in time, because the cycle doesn't require faith, only repetition. If you've made it this far, you already know too much. You've heard the names, seen the signs, felt the cold breath of something that should have ended, but didn't. So now I leave you with only this. Watch the mirrors, count the children, and if someone offers you a music box, don't open it. If this story impacted you, don't let it vanish like so many others, like the faces in those photographs, like the names beneath that soil, like the children who never left. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel. There are still many other names that deserve to be remembered.